How does an outnumbered, exhausted army of Englishmen, standing ankle-deep in mud, defeat a vastly superior French force on its home soil? The Battle of Agincourt, fought on October 25, 1415, remains one of the most celebrated military triumphs in medieval history. It's a tale of strategy, innovation, and sheer willpower against overwhelming odds. To understand this monumental clash, we must delve into the context of the 100 Years' War, dissect the events of that fateful day, and explore the battlefield's gruesome details. By the early 15th century, England and France had been locked in the 100 Years' War, a complex and prolonged conflict rooted in disputes over land and the English monarchy's claim to the French throne. King Henry V of England, newly crowned in 1413, sought to assert his legitimacy and unite his realm through military conquest. His eyes were fixed on France. In 1415, Henry launched his campaign, landing with an army of roughly 12,000 men near the French port of Harfleur. After a grueling siege that lasted over a month, the town fell, but the English forces paid a heavy price. Disease and attrition reduced their numbers significantly, leaving Henry with approximately 6,000 soldiers. With winter approaching, Henry intended to retreat to Calais, an English stronghold, before returning to England. However, his march across northern France was fraught with danger. French forces shadowed his movements, their numbers swelling as regional lords and knights rallied to their king, Charles VI. By late October, the French had blocked Henry's route near the village of Agincourt. The battlefield was a narrow, open plain flanked by dense woods on both sides. This terrain, seemingly mundane, would become a pivotal factor in the battle. The French army, estimated at between 20,000 and 30,000 men, vastly outnumbered Henry's depleted forces. It was a classic medieval mismatch. On one side, a large, heavily armored French host dominated by its elite cavalry and infantry. On the other, a smaller, exhausted English army comprised largely of longbowmen. The French were confident of victory. They had the numerical advantage and were fighting on home soil. But their overconfidence led to critical mistakes, while Henry's leadership turned the dire situation to his advantage. Henry V knew that conventional tactics would be suicidal. Instead, he relied on the longbow, a weapon that had already proved devastating in earlier battles such as Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356. English longbowmen, skilled in firing at rapid rates, could pierce armor and sow chaos among enemy ranks. Approximately 5,000 of Henry's troops were longbowmen, equipped with 6-foot-long yew bows capable of firing arrows over 200 yards. Before dawn on October 25th, St. Crispin's Day, Henry arranged his troops in a tight defensive formation. He positioned his archers on the flanks, protected by sharpened wooden stakes angled outward to ward off cavalry charges. The men-at-arms, armored soldiers on foot, were placed in the center with smaller groups held in reserve. The English king himself donned a golden crown over his helmet, making him an easily identifiable target, but also a rallying point for his troops. The French army, in contrast, was poorly organized and hampered by internal divisions. Commanders argued over strategy, with some advocating for caution and others pushing for an immediate attack. Ultimately, the French adopted a staggered formation, cavalry at the front, followed by heavily armored infantry, with additional forces held in reserve. Their plan was simple: overwhelm the English lines with brute force. As dawn broke, the French army advanced slowly, their vanguard composed of men-at-arms clad in heavy armor. From their position, the English archers unleashed a devastating hail of arrows. The French cavalry, tasked with sweeping away the archers, charged forward but faltered. The wooden stakes and a relentless barrage of arrows mowed down horses and riders alike, just as they had at Crécy decades earlier. The French vanguard pushed forward under immense pressure. The mud, churned by heavy rains, made movement difficult. French soldiers slipped, fell, and staggered, becoming easy targets for English arrows. As they pressed into the narrow field, the vanguard split into chaotic columns, forcing men into an increasingly congested space. This only amplified the carnage as those who fell became obstacles for those behind. When the French finally reached the English lines, They were exhausted and immobilized by the mud and chaos. Here, the English men-at-arms engaged them in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Though the Duke of York was killed, and Henry himself was struck by an arrow, the English held their ground. The French main battle joined the fight, and as the English archers ran out of arrows, they entered the melee armed with daggers, swords, and hammers, proving deadly in close combat. Despite the growing pressure on the English line, the French assault began to waver. The Duke of Brabant arrived late to the battlefield with a small force, only to be captured. Elsewhere, French knights such as the Duke of Alençon and the Duke of Orleans were either killed or taken prisoner. The French men-at-arms, faced with mounting casualties and exhausted from the prolonged slaughter, began to flee. As the English began collecting prisoners and arrows, Henry suddenly faced a new threat. A portion of the remaining French forces, under Coligny de Brabant, appeared to be regrouping for another attack. Fearing his dispersed army would be vulnerable, Henry made the controversial decision to order the execution of non-royal prisoners. This act, shocking to medieval standards of chivalry, was likely a calculated move to prevent the French from using the prisoners to rally or gain leverage in a renewed assault. At last, the remaining French forces broke and fled, leaving the battlefield littered with bodies. The English, though victorious, were battered and exhausted. The French had suffered catastrophic losses, with thousands of knights, nobles, and soldiers killed. Among the dead were many of France's elite, and those captured included high-ranking figures like the Duke of Orleans. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and follow for more fascinating tales from history. Have thoughts or questions? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you.